when you've been collecting video games as long as I have, you begin to associate certain games and certain consoles with particular times of year, or at least I do. There's a certain nostalgia to just a certain point in the year where you look back and remember a time when you discovered something. And for me, the very end of winter and start of spring was always the time for Sega, and particularly the Sega Saturn. So I want to focus on the Saturn, and another reason why this kind of popped into my mind is that I realized that I have been a Sega Saturn collector for a decade. I picked up my first Saturn, and I think I've mentioned this in a video or maybe a social media post before, but I decided to pick up my Sega Saturn in March of 2011. And I remember it very, very vividly because my Sega Saturn was shipped out on the date of the earthquake and tsunami in Japan, and I picked up the Japanese Sega Saturn first, and I remember kind of waking up to that news, and then I got an email shipment notification from that EMS company, and it said that the Saturn had shipped out early that morning. And sure enough, when I got it, there was the date. So that was when I first kind of got into Sega Saturn collecting, and perhaps one of the conscious or subconscious, I can't remember back that far, but one of the reasons why I wanted to pick up the Sega Saturn was because that March-April time frame is when I first discovered the Sega Saturn way back in the day. I never owned it myself, and in fact, I was very skeptical of the Saturn because I had been burned, at least in my mind. I thought I was burned by the Sega CD. I was burned by the 32X of Sega just being a kind of haphazard, late to the game, and not delivering on their promises. So a friend of mine picked up the Saturn, and I remember playing it, at his place. Now, I think the Saturn had that early launch, I believe in May. It was supposed to come out a little bit later, but it was launched in May, and he had gotten it right away. And he had Panzer Dragoon. Now, my memory is perhaps a little rusty here. I just remember him getting it early, and then I remember myself playing Panzer Dragoon and Daytona USA. So I remember playing that again, spring, summer. Now his birthday was always in March, so the Saturn perhaps didn't come out in March, so maybe he got it a little bit later that year, but those are the initial memories, and I honestly wasn't terribly impressed. The Saturn, to me, yeah, it was the first 3D console that I had played, but Panzer Dragoon just didn't do it for me, and still to this day doesn't. And Daytona, though, was different, because I think the Daytona game on the Saturn, that had recently come out in the arcades, and I thought the Saturn did a solid job of recreating that, even though the Saturn version is troubled as far as the frame rate goes. Still actually think it controls pretty well, and I think controls better than the Sega Dreamcast version of the game, even though that version looks absolutely superior. So, it was cool, and it reminded me of that time, of that discovery of the Saturn. So as I said, this friend had a birthday in March, and I had some other friends who had birthdays right around that time, March, April, end of April, early May, and at that time, all of these guys would have their birthday parties at a place called Sports Park USA. Now, we all grew up in northern New Jersey, right outside of New York City, and this place was, in my mind, the biggest arcade in the area. It was kind of tucked away in a strip mall on one of the highways that kind of leads into the city, and it was just a really, really popular place. It was a sports arena that was filled with arcade games. And the structure is still there. And it is an ice hockey rink, as I recall. But back then, you'd go in, so you're a kid, you're 8 years old, 10 years old, 12 years old, whatever it was. I mean, I was going throughout that time, so maybe by the time that the Sega Saturn came out, I was a little bit older than that. But to me, that place was synonymous with Sega because it had all of the classic Sega arcade games. And right around the time of the Saturn, so 93 through 95, 96, I was always able to get on Virtua Fighter and Virtua Fighter 2 at these birthday parties. So I've always associated playing Virtua Fighter with the start of spring. And as weird as this is going to sound, every year I play Virtua Fighter around this time. I actually open the windows on a morning when it's like 55, 60, and you can kind of feel, the hint of winter still in the air, but the beginning of spring. And it just takes me back to Sports Park and to those great memories of all the birthday parties that my friends had there. So it's been a decade, and I've done a lot of retro video game collecting in that decade, and actually for longer, but within that time frame. And what stands out is that the Sega Saturn has been the most enjoyable and consistently rewarding console to collect for. And that's for a number of reasons. One is that I kind of focused on the Japanese import Saturn. Like I said, the US Saturn never really did it for me. I would have far preferred the games that came out in Japan. They weren't available, or they were very expensive to import. Plus, you had to have some way of playing them. And back then, I don't believe the Action Replay expansion cartridge was available. So you're kind of stuck with the US games. And when the PlayStation came out and the N64 came out, to me, those were the superior consoles. Those were the consoles that I wanted to own. And so in the time, Saturn just kind of faded. But now, or then, 10 years ago, through the magic of eBay, you could get the Japanese Saturn. And at that time, I would say 2011 through 2015, I felt like it was pretty reasonably priced to buy a lot of games that either had a minimal language barrier or that were relatively easy to play. And so I really built my collection on those games, plus a bunch of weird, quirky Saturn games that you could only get on that console. And what I kind of discovered was the Japanese Saturn was the final expression of late 80s, early 90s Japanese culture in digital form. And it's kind of a weird statement, but I always saw that the PC Engine, TurboGrafx 16 PC Engine, the CD versions of those games kind of did so many things with classic Japanese anime, classic Japanese game ideas, and the Saturn carried that over and amplified it. Because I think whatever came out after the PC Engine, PCFX, just couldn't really cut it in the marketplace. So as I was getting older, I found myself having nostalgia for that time period, whether it was classic Japanese electronics, whether it was classic Japanese anime. And, the Saturn was a way to experience all of that. Now, you take into account that when it came out, the Saturn was largely a disappointment because it just couldn't keep up with 3D gaming, at least in the sense that the PlayStation and the N64 were presenting three-dimensional gaming. So it always felt a little weak in that regard. And yeah, it was a good 2D system back in the day, and it did certain things and handled certain sprites. Think about the Marvel Capcom fighters. It did that better than the PlayStation. We knew that, but at the time that was like not so impressive. It's like, yeah, I want to play those games, but for me, it was all about 3D. And I think a lot of people had that experience. But now, when there's a nostalgia for hand-drawn 2D sprites for old school games, I think we're discovering that the Saturn in its afterlife is the ultimate love letter to that era of gaming, because whether you're playing side-scrolling game, whether you're playing a shmup, the art style, the design just looks awesome. You add to that CD music and some good 3D games, and this becomes just an amazing console to collect for. And for me, the games that kind of best express that now are the Capcom fighting games, and to a certain extent the Neo Geo games that made it to the Saturn. Whereas back then I kind of looked at it and said, yeah, that looks good, good animation, fluid, I get it, and then moved on. Now, the polygons, the early polygon games look awful, and you go back to that and say, it is amazing that the Saturn was so close to the arcades, and I think it was a shame that we didn't appreciate that back then. So as this decade progressed, I picked up some accessories for the Sega Saturn, and I just kind of want to go through them. And I think I'm going to start off first with the controllers, which obviously, technically is, they're accessories, but you need them to use the unit. But I just feel like the Saturn controller was the best old school controller, by far. It just, from a tactile standpoint, it felt great. It felt, and is to this day, super accurate. And one of the cool things was that back in 2011, I was actually able to buy the black Sega Saturn controllers new, or at least I got one of them new. You could still, I've somehow found like old unopened stock. So, buttons crisp, the shoulder buttons with that, PC mouse click to them. They were awesome. And I just, to this day, I find them to be absolutely satisfying to play. And just how each button was slightly higher than the last as you kind of move to the right. And, they each had a really precise feel, the right amount of resistance, particularly on the top three buttons. Just a great for fighting games, great for those 2D games. Now, I did pick up the 3D controller, which admittedly feels less wonderful than the classic 6-button variety, but it was interesting, and I think arguably at the time it was the first of its kind. And yeah, I mean, Nights into Dreams, some of the racing games, it's different. It doesn't feel bad, but compared to what we have experienced now, kind of take it or leave it. And then relatively recently, I picked up one of the Retrobit Saturn controllers, which, it's not quite the same. It doesn't feel quite as good. The shoulder buttons don't have that mouse click to them. But honestly, it plays well enough, and it is a reasonable substitute, if you don't have the original controllers, or if your original controllers break. So I think that might have been $25 or something. I think it's a decent option. So when a system does arcade games, and particularly arcade fighters, as well as the Saturn, you naturally want an arcade stick. And I picked up two over the years. One was the US Virtuous stick, and as I think we all know, that is a horrible disappointment. That was another example of something I got, that was new old stock. I believe I paid $20 for it, and for $20, it's something, but certainly not a peripheral that I would want to use on a regular basis, especially when the traditional controllers are so good. The other arcade stick that I picked up was the Japanese Virtuous stick, and then I picked that up maybe a year ago, actually, and you can kind of see the full review on the channel. What is it like to use in 2020, 2021. It's much better. It's certainly, if you had a choice between the Japanese Virtuous Stick and the US Virtuous Stick, you would obviously choose the Japanese Virtuous Stick. Depending on the model of that you either got I think a Sanwa or JLF, Sanwa JLF, something like that. Joystick, maybe it was a Saimitsu, I don't know. But you got a quality joystick or you got a knockoff. And I don't mean a knockoff like someone put in a cheap one today, but that just Sega used two different joysticks. And sadly, I got the knockoff. And if you go back to that video, I think I talk about, how you can spot it. And the buttons are not that precise, and they kind of, if you don't hit them right in the center, if you kind of hit them from the side, they either don't register or they stick. That just might be a feature of the stick that I got. But, yeah, I was slightly disappointed by that. Again, it was a cool thing to have. It has an awesome, iconic look. So I really can't complain too much. I think I paid maybe $120 to get it imported from Japan. And, I got the box, so I was happy about that. But I still had this nagging feeling like, is there a solution to get a real serious joystick onto the Saturn? So I did some research, and I found an interesting product. It is called a Brook Super Adapter, and this company actually releases a lot of modern to old school joystick adapters. I actually have one for the PS2 that worked out pretty well. They just came out with this one for the Sega Saturn. And while I haven't tested it extensively, it seems to do the job. I can get my Hori Vuelix working. I have a Razer Pantera, and these are superior methods for playing Sega Saturn games, the arcade fighters. Feels so much better, so much more precise to use a modern joystick compared to the Sega Virtuous sticks. So preliminary results are positive. I plan on using it a lot more this summer. And, I would say if you're interested, definitely check out some YouTube reviews. It is an interesting product. As far as video quality goes, for the longest time, I was connecting my Saturn through one of the input ports on an old Panasonic DVD RAM recorder that had the reputation of having a pretty good comb filter and was kind of a good way to pass analog sources to HDMI. It's probably one of the earliest ways to do that. But as time moved on, obviously there have been other solutions. I haven't gotten into the FrameMeister or the open source alternative to that. But I did pick up one of the pound cables. I talked about that here on the channel. And my basic point was, it's not great, but it's a sufficient upgrade. And, Saturn was looking good and sounded pretty good, actually. Sounded much better than running it through that old DVD player. Now, it's cheaply made, and over time I've noticed that it gets a little hot and kind of has some pops and fizzles to it. I mean, it's still works, but I'm not terribly confident in in this being a long-term solution. So I ordered a Rad 2X several months ago now, or whenever the last time it was available. They're hard to find. Still haven't gotten it, but I'm hoping that will be the audio-visual solution moving forward. This next item is not an accessory for the Saturn, but it kind of is a nice companion to Sega Saturn collecting, and that is the Sega Saturn Perfect Guide. This is a book that I picked up from Amazon Japan a couple of months ago, maybe around Christmas, and it is a wonderful piece of Sega Saturn nostalgia. When you talk about accessories, it actually lists all of the hardware, all of the accessories that ever came out for the Saturn, plus it documents every single game released for the system by year. So if you're into Sega Saturn collecting, it's really useful to see and discover and to kind of have a chronological reference for the console. Now, it is obviously all in Japanese, but if you can understand a bit of katakana, it's good enough as a reference source. Plus, there's some oddities in here as far as hardware that are really cool that I didn't even know existed. So, if you're a Saturn fan, you grew up in the era, this is a wonderful piece of nostalgia and kind of a great walk down memory lane. So lastly, as far as accessories go, I picked up the Virtua gun for the Saturn and Virtua Cop 1 and 2. Now, the Virtua gun was the kind of the bright orange gun that you could pick up in the US. The Japanese gun was black. And, these were fun games. I was very surprised how well the Saturn ran them. And the gun felt accurate and like a reasonable representation of the arcade nostalgia. So I think maybe altogether for the gun and the two games, it might have been $40, $50. And I definitely felt it was worth that to kind of have that arcade-like experience. So over that time, I want to kind of talk about how my game collecting has progressed. When I initially picked up the Saturn, it was definitely, especially the Japanese Saturn. Now, obviously, as you've seen in this footage, I do have a U.S. Saturn as well as kind of a backup. But for me, this was it started off as an experiment, and then it became a hobby, and then it became a passion. So in that experimental phase, I was just looking to get the classic games, the Panzer Dragoon, Night into Dreams, all the Sega Saturn, the Sega 3D fighting games. A couple of the Midway games I thought were pretty good, at least for with that nostalgic lens. Things like the WrestleMania the arcade game, In Your House arcade game, Mortal Kombat. So once I got those down, I was then focused on some of the Japanese stuff. And one of the things I used to do on the channel was something called Saturn Saturdays, where I would just play weird import Saturn games. I would buy them by the dozen, basically, back, like I said, 5, 6, 7 years ago. This stuff was reasonably cheap. So maybe for $20, $30, I could get, 6, 7 games in. And then a few weeks later, I'd do the same thing, and I would just have a stack of games to play and discover on stream. So, that was fun. That was, again, getting back to, reliving the nostalgia of 90s Japan. And, as you can see here, I'm just kind of cycling through them. Not going to go into anything in depth. I do have some videos on the channel kind of documenting this, and I think since those streams are still up, so you can kind of see the weird and wacky side of the Sega Saturn. Now, I had always been a fan of Japanese Mahjong, and I picked up some Mahjong games, and I became quite the collector of the Saturn Mahjong games. And, they are, for the most part, not the serious types. They're, super real Mahjong and varieties like that. Strip Mahjong games, which, as I've talked about in a couple of videos, obviously, if you're into the kind of hentai stuff, I mean, that's one thing. But they're actually games that, if you understand Mahjong, the fantasy is not just the woman you're playing against and trying to get to strip, but it's actually a trainer on kind of the fantasy hands that you can get, certain combinations of tiles that if you play a serious game, if you play in real life, if you play an online competition, or things that you might see, once every X thousand games, and they sort of pop up, constantly here. So I actually found them pretty useful to, in a sense, learn those hands and at least have some knowledge of what the hand construction looks like. Plus, they have wonderful soundtracks, and the animation quality, as far as the full motion video, was pretty impressive. Now, I am not a fan of the actual progression of those FMV scenes, so I pretty much would just skip over them. But they're a unique kind of oddity if you're into that. And certainly another oddity on the Saturn that I picked up was the Sankyo Fever pachinko games with the pachinko controller. Now, I'm a fan, obviously, of Japanese gambling, as you've seen, and I've always had a fascination with pachinko, this kind of mix between, on the one hand, a slot machine, pinball. It's just so stereotypically Japanese. And I knew that there were these 3 games that worked with this pachinko controller, and for whatever reason, I was like, I have to pick these up. The games were, there's 3 of them, and these are the only 3 games that work with the controller. They are your average 90s Japanese pachinko game, but it is fun playing with the controller and regulating the ball release speed. It's a little bit better than playing with a joypad, but there's no reason to ever buy this other than you like the odd, you like the weird, and that has certainly been part of the allure of the Saturn for me. So as time progressed, I definitely wanted to up my collecting game, if you will, and that's when I kind of had this personal project of purchasing every 2D fighter on the Saturn, and I got pretty close. I have all of the Capcom games, including Street Fighter Alpha or 03, which is, I'm not going to call it a holy grail of the Saturn, but it's one of the more desirable games. And it's actually, I think, again, an example of just how good the Saturn can be, because I think a lot of people rightfully argue that this is better than the Dreamcast version, one of the best ways that you could play this game. Is it my favorite Street Fighter Zero game? No, that would be Street Fighter Zero 2, which is very, very cheap on the Saturn. But, I really liked getting that. And I picked up a lot of the Neo Geo games. Fatal Fury Special Bout, I believe, is really, really good. I like Waku Waku as a game. Saturn struggles with kind of the scaling aspects of it. But, King of Fighters games on the Saturn. So I don't have everything, but like I said, I think, that was like the splurge for me. But then as time has gone on, I've been a little bit more strategic, a little bit more reserved about what I'm going to purchase. I tend to try to keep to the $60 to $100 range. In that range, I picked up things like Layer Section, Dodonpachi, Power Drift, Sonic R, which, okay, that was towards the lower end. That may not have been $60, actually. Not a great game, but a classic soundtrack. I can't bring myself at this point to spend $200 to $300 on games that I really want to play, like the high-end shooters, Albert Odyssey, things like that, Magic Knight, Ray Earth. They are, I think, a bit out of a reasonable price range at this point in my life. Wish I'd picked them up earlier. But I still do look every spring, can I find 1 or 2 games that are unique? And I've just started that process for this spring. Didn't get a chance to pick anything up and get it in the video. But at this point, it is a tradition. It is something that I will do for a very long time to come. Now, to conclude, I want to talk about the future of collecting for the Sega Saturn. Now, for me personally, I think it's going to be moving in the direction of picking up some reproductions. As I just said, I'm not going to spend $300, $400, $500 on some of these titles that have just exploded in price. But I do, there's just some experiences I want to have on the Saturn. So I may kind of look around. I know there's a company called Nighthawk Games, and if you have the Pseudo Saturn Kai cartridge, you can play repros of all the high dollar value games. Maybe they're 15 or 20 bucks. So I may wind up doing that. I could see myself moving to a RetroArch and a kind of solution, building a PC, backing up the games that I have to a certain degree. And, granted, RetroArch is not... it's good, and it's certainly improved with the different emulators that it can run on the Saturn. I have not had a bad experience with it, but I know it's not perfect. So I will do it as like I said, as a backup to do it for posterity. But I do think the Saturn hardware is particularly robust. I mean, I got these, I don't know when these consoles were manufactured, but I picked up the Japanese one, 15, 16 years after it came out. It ran perfectly then. It runs perfectly now. So I may also dabble in some of the I don't know what you would want to call them, the ODE drives or the hard drives that you can either hard mod or attach via the video card port. And if I'm going to go the backup route and I still want to actually use the hardware, I may wind up doing that. And I think that does open up some possibilities for the Saturn, because the consoles will die someday. And I think it's nice that you could still use the system even if the drive fails. But I think the legacy of the Saturn, because emulation has not been perfect, is that it's one of the last great systems that you want to experience on original hardware. And I think it's developed that reputation that this is one of those unique ones that you really need to buy and own and play in its original form. And I don't want that to die, not for selfish financial reasons. I mean, I guess you could make the argument, well, if you're saying that, then you're trying to drive up the price, and the price is already through the roof. But I kind of see there's just something unique about the Saturn. Like I said, it's a cross section of gaming history. It's that perfect combination of the 16-bit sprite-based generation, moving into that 3D era. And I would argue it's one of the systems that misunderstood that transition. Famously, I mean, I mentioned the PCFX. You had like the Atari Jaguar, the 3DO, the Amiga CD32, systems that just didn't read the market correctly. And all of those systems were disappointing in their day, but it is just so much fun to look back on their vision of the future. And I do think that the Saturn's vision of the future, a future in which 2D sprite-based games would persist alongside 3D, actually is a more appealing vision, because what the system can do now, I think, like I said, is way more appreciated than what it could do back in the day. So it has been a wonderful, wonderful ride collecting for the Sega Saturn. I can't believe a decade has gone by. I mean, if you've listened to me long enough in this video, it's almost like I've been talking about the Saturn for a decade. But, I just wanted to come on and just say my piece about the Sega Saturn. Sometimes as a collector, you look back and you say, was it worth it? Could I have done things differently with my time and with my money? And perhaps in a broad sense, you could occasionally make that argument about game collecting, but not about the Saturn itself. I'm happy that I got into it, and it has been just one of my favorite experiences in retro gaming.